When Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey were cast as Joel and Ellie in HBO's The Last of Us, there was an initial pushback. But where did that doubt come from? Both actors had worked with HBO before, and their performances in Game of Thrones was, generally speaking, very well received. I think there are two clear places to start when talking about this uncertainty. First, adaptations have a history of failing, often making changes that are unnecessary and don't stay true to the source material. There are also consistent growing pains that come with taking a story and adapting it from one medium to another. I also think whenever you're working with something that people hold very dear, mega fans will hold every decision a show makes to an incredibly high standard. When art is special to someone, especially something that people consider a masterpiece, they're very protective of it. This leads nicely into my second point. In a lot of ways, the plot of The Last of Us is very simple, but the characters are very complex. So when so much of The Last of Us relies on the chemistry between Joel and Ellie, it's easy to be nervous about new actors coming in to represent those characters. Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson's performance as Joel and Ellie, paired with the incredible writing, is a fundamental core to what made the game so successful. So the standards right away were set pretty high. And to some degree, if Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey tried too hard to emulate Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson, I think they would come up short. It is, however, very important that the core of the character stays true to who they are, because while I believe Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson were iconic, Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey are contributing to their own masterpiece. First, let's start with a simple concept: expectations. To understand expectations, let's look at Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Historically, one-off sequels, especially for side characters and franchises, tend to be underwhelming. For example, with Puss in Boots, the 2011 and 2012 spin-offs were moderately received, especially in comparison to The Last Wish. And I think because expectations were set so low, when people did give it a shot, they were blown away. We can look at case after case where high expectations lead to disappointment. Another example is in video games. Cyberpunk 2077 and No Man's Sky could never live up to the hype built up around their release. And in both of those cases, we've seen a little bit of a rebound. When they were given time to develop and work out some of the kinks, they became pretty decent games. So how the hell did Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey respond to the immense pressure that the very loyal fan base of The Last of Us brought in response to their casting? In a weird way, I think it was because they weren't very familiar with the source material. I love that Henry Cavill was cast as Geralt in The Witcher. I think he's a major reason why that show was as good as it was for as long as it was before falling apart. So you might assume I was disappointed when I found out that Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey weren't very familiar with the game before they were cast. But in reality, I think the lack of familiarity allowed them the opportunity to break away from the intense gravitational pull of Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker's representation of those characters. Here's the thing about acting. It's a very subjective art form. It's actually one of the most common pushbacks I get in my previous videos. When I praise an actor's ability, more often than not, someone in the comment section strongly disagrees. And in a weird way, they might not be wrong, because acting is really just about being convincing. So if someone wasn't sold on an actor's performance, it would make sense that they'd be critical of it. So it's tricky to be definitive when it comes to an actor's performance. But I believe both the game and the show have beautiful representations of Joel and Ellie, with masterful performances from all four actors. I think there are a couple points in the show where I felt like Bella Ramsey's acting felt a little flat. However, besides maybe Pedro Pascal, I believe she is carrying the show. What she's doing is not easy. There have been multiple episodes so far that are completely reliant on her performance. Take for example episode 5. By making Henry much younger, it put Ellie in a different position than in the game. She's both a friend and a role model, and no scene better represents that than that scene of them on the beds the night before Henry turns. It starts with Henry opening up to Ellie. He voices his fears and expresses his admiration of her bravery. It's this beautiful connection between two children who grew up in this broken world. There's this intense maturity to the way she handled the entire situation, contrasted by a hopeful ignorance. She's a kid that's been forced to mature too quickly, which I think ties back into the core of who Ellie is as a character in both the game and the show. She often accepts the reality of a situation, but will fight for what she wants. In some ways, she was forced to grow up quickly, while in others, she's still just a kid. This juxtaposition between a hard exterior shell and moments of vulnerability also applies to Joel. They're both headstrong characters, but Ellie's consistent pursuit of connection leads to her breaking down the walls Joel has built as a necessary coping mechanism for the hardship he's experienced, the harm he's caused. It capture that energy, who those characters are, doing that amidst major changes in the story, and with huge expectations from the previous story's fanbase, is an incredibly difficult task, but it feels like they've succeeded. And while there may be differences in the way the characters feel, I'm blown away by the way Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey matched these astronomical expectations. There were many moments that stood out to me where I was blown away by